So welcome everyone, and in honor of International Clean Air Day, today on September 7th, we welcome everyone to our online dialogue, Decarbonizing Urban Transport, an intergenerational discussion organized by Generation Climate Europe, where we will be addressing issues for decarbonizing urban mobility in European cities. So the format of the event is as follows. First, we will start with an interactive task where we will split everyone into breakout rooms, and we will discuss the different modes of transport that we use in our everyday life. Then we will start our panel discussion where we will ask questions to our speakers, and then we will open the floor to everyone where you can share your questions and comments. And throughout the event, we have with us Fanny, who will produce a live sketching for us on the issues that we will touch upon. To introduce ourselves, I'm Hermione. I'm Generations Climate Europe Clean Mobility Coordinator, and together with us here is Kelly, who is our project lead on Clean Cities, and we will be moderating the event together. And also with us today, we also have Gemma and Rosie from our Clean Mobility team. So we would also like to introduce our speakers. So today with us, we have Charlotte Norlund-Matthijsse from the Commission of Transport. Charlotte is currently working as a policy advisor on the cabinet of EU Transport Commission at Dina Valean. Charlotte covers topics such as connected and automated mobility, urban mobility, recharging points, and research and innovation. And she has also experience in various other policy areas, citizen mobilization and local community building. So thank you for being here with us. We also have Julia Deida from Bundjugend. Julia is a member of the National Board of Bundjugend, which is a German environmental youth organization. And more specifically, she works on establishing campaigns, demonstration, panel discussions, and meetings with politicians to further a sustainable and just mobility transition. It's great to have you with us here today. We also have James Comer from Hitachi. So James is a government and external affairs lead for Carbon Zero at Hitachi. He's a key part of the team, and he has led a number of Hitachi's activities at COP26, including showcasing the work his team has done in transitioning Europe's largest bus depot to EV. We also have Laura Lopez from ICLEI. Laura is a Sustainable Mobility Junior Officer at ICLEI, which is a global network at local and regional governments who are committed to sustainable urban development. And Laura has experience in supporting policy making and solutions for achieving low carbon, inclusive and livable cities. She also looks at ways to engage the youth in climate action. So welcome, Laura. And we also have Hugo Mann from the Clean Cities campaign. Hugo is the urban fleets campaigner who leads the campaigns on the electrification of delivery fleets and is experienced in developing and implementing campaigns at grassroots levels. And he has worked for 5 years at the European Movement UK, where he built the campaign network to be the largest pro-European one in the UK. So welcome, Hugo, and welcome everyone. We are very pleased to have you all here with us today. At the end of the event, we also have some closing words from the Commissioner for Environment, Virginijus Sinkevicius. So thank you all for being here, and we are very excited. So to start with, we would like to give you a bit of a background on who GC is and why we want to discuss this topic with you today. So Generation Climate Europe is a coalition of youth-led networks, including, for example, Youth and Environment and ESN, who advocate for stronger action on the EU level on climate and environmental issues. We have branches or national organizations in 46 different countries in Europe, including all EU member states, which is very crucial for us as we want to represent young people from all over Europe. And we have different working groups. One of them is the Clean Mobility, which is with our Clean Cities team. And the Clean Cities team has put together now a project called Youth for Zero Emissions Urban Mobility that highlights the importance of the EU policy in tackling the local challenges of decarbonizing urban mobility and aims to empower young people to advocate for clean and sustainable transport. So that leads us to today's topic of our online dialogue on decarbonizing urban mobility and the challenges that the different stakeholders face. So as the majority of young people in Europe live in urban areas, in congested, in consequence, air and noise pollution are one of the most important issues that people face. And of course, we don't want young people growing up with health problems in congested and hostile cities. So decarbonizing transport is central for making our cities more livable, while at the same time addressing the climate crisis. So in order to learn from each other, we've prepared an interactive task at the beginning. So we will be split into breakout rooms for 5 minutes. And we want you to search the different ways that you can get from your house to a place that you often visit. It can be your workplace, it can be your university, it can be a friend's house, it can be a park. So using Google Maps, we want you to select the 2 different addresses and find the various ways that it suggests. And then we want you to compare with the rest of the group and share the results. So we want you to look at the different options that it offers. Is it car transport? Is it by public transport? Is it cycling? How far is it by walking? What is the quickest way? What is the most affordable one? And what is the one that you actually use? And what are the differences with each other? So when we come back from the breakout rooms, we will also share the results. So now we will be split into the breakout rooms. Okay, everyone should be back. So thank you very much for doing the task. We hope you enjoyed that. So please feel free to share the results of the breakout rooms. Anyone that wants to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to if you want. So, hi everyone. Criven and I were looking at his journey from home in Dublin to his centre of his work, which is in the city of Dublin as well. Quite ironically, because he's actually in the process of travelling between the two right now. And so in terms of transport options, there was quite a few. You had bus, cycling, and then driving obviously as well. Quickest, ironically as well, was actually cycling. Takes about 21 minutes, but then you have the added kind of complication around getting hot and sweaty, and then what do you do when you get to the office and things like that if you don't have a shower, which I think is a problem that a lot of us probably have. I certainly do in central London, as well as risking your life every time you do cycle through central London as well. Affordability, I guess, if you remove cycling from that equation, you do the bus, and I think that's what he most likely does most days. But I suppose also then, you know, cycling, if you've got a cycle to work scheme or something like that, it's also very affordable. And so then, unfortunately, today for answer to 4, he was using car, but that was purely just based on the time constraints of it, because I think the bus was about 3 times as long as a car, right? The route's not as direct, which is probably a given in most circumstances. So yeah, I think that was all of our answers.
Anyone that wants to go next?
Sure. So Hugo, Martha and I compared how we went to work, and Hugo and I are in London. So we obviously public transport is not that affordable in London, especially the tube. And then cycling is, as was previously mentioned, quite dangerous, and also if you live like quite far away, because it's very spread out, it is maybe impossible to cycle to work if it's an hour journey and it's uphill. And then Martha lives a 20-minute walk from her office, so that's quite practical, and also her office has places to put her bike, so it's so that was quite good.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I can share what came out from our group. I was with Laura and Gemma, and Laura and Gemma both work from home. So, and I think we all agreed, we all used public transport the most to get from home to our different spaces. One thing Gemma mentioned was that how expensive her bus was often for the amount of time. The bus ride is just 10 minutes, but she would spend €6 on the ticket to and from her destination. And then Laura and I both had our destinations in Germany, and we were talking about the different difficulties we had with connections between buses and subways, or also trains between cities and within cities themselves. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing. We hope that this interactive task kind of demonstrates the differences between cities when traveling, and that it also highlights the difficulties associated with urban mobility, such as the lack of affordability and accessibility that was mentioned. So after having discussed the problems that people face in getting to their destination, it is time also to start our discussion and hear from the speakers about this issue. So we will now start the panel discussion by asking our speakers a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor to questions by the participants. So now we'll hand it to you over, Kelly, and you can start the discussion.
Yes, thank you. I also started sharing my screen again. So thank you for handing over to me, Hermione. First, we start with a first question for our Commission representative, Charlotte Noland-Matthiesen. The first question is, what are the Commission's new initiatives about clean urban mobility, and how do they include the needs of the youth?
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's nice to be in this forum and also hear what let's say from this first little breakout session, what the different challenges were. That was very interesting, and of course also something that we'll be able to use when we go forward with our policies in the Commission. So yeah, I can say a few words about what we've been working on, and I think the latest that is to know is that in December year 2021 we presented the new EU Urban Mobility Framework. So this is basically a framework that helps to support member states and regions and cities, but also you could say the youth, to develop these safe and accessible, inclusive and smart and resilient, and of course sustainable urban mobility. And for that we have this timeline on that it needs to be done way ahead of 2050, where we need to be climate neutral, right? So one of the tools we're using is the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans, as we call it in EU jargon, so the SUMPs. Which are these plans that cities can adopt, making sure that various measures are used to tackle the important challenges, which are congestion, emissions, road safety, and noise. In this new urban mobility framework that we adopted, the main focus nowadays, or that we've put on is on public transport and active mobility. And what we call active mobility is walking and cycling. We also really prioritize zero-emission solutions for urban fleets, and that's, for example, taxis, ride-hailing services, last mile delivery services, and also we need to look at how cities can better construct and modernize multimodal hubs, so the using of different types of options and services to get from one place to another. And for that, we need to focus, cities need, so again, here maybe a little caveat, a parenthesis, is that in terms of urban mobility, the Commission doesn't, the EU doesn't have any competence per se. So it all, let's say, the power to act lies with cities themselves or member states. But the Commission is here to support and give a direction. And I think the newest here with 2021 and the European Green Deal is that in terms of we are creating some kind of binding obligation on cities through different other new legislation that pertains to cities also, such as recharging points or innovation. So just some examples. But so that's why we need now also for cities to have focus on an innovative approaches. And this is also where the youth comes in, of course. And so at EU level, there's several initiatives that exist to make sure that the needs of the youth are taken into account, and that the youth is part of shaping and redesigning the urban mobility in our cities. One of these initiatives is the Civitas initiative. And so Civitas has one chapter, which is called the Civitas Educational Network and the Fresh Brains Program. And here basically youth participate and contribute to discussions on transport and mobility with basically the host organizations. And so the youth are give creative viewpoints and ideas to the industry's problems and challenges. And this is done by various activities. And then there's also, of course, everyone knows here, I think that this year, 2022, is the European Year of Youth. So there's several, in terms of mobility and transport, there's several activities that are being organized this year. So we have the European Mobility Week that is starting next week, where there will be many different, all over Europe. So this is cities organizing different mobility events like the Car Free Day, which is the most famous one probably. But there's also many other types of workshops, and also youth involving workshops to better understand how to integrate youth's needs, but also how to include youth more and communicate to the youth. And I can give maybe two more examples. There is one which is called Youth on the Move, which is also 5 different ways that cities can better engage youth or young people in urban mobility planning and the campaigns. And so it's range from 16 to 24 and with city staff as well. And so here it's more about campaigning and also finding solutions for intelligent transports. And finally, we have the Urban Mobility Days, which take place in Czech Republic in Brno. When is this? Between the 20th and the 23rd of September. And there will be, and it's also available online. And so there will be 2 dedicated sessions for and with the youth, both the closing plenary and also a dedicated session. So I think this is a little bit in a snapshot, and I hope I didn't speak too long.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for the introduction about the youth plans on clean mobility, discussing the sustainable urban mobility plans and Civitas, which also focuses on the needs of the youth. Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. Now we can move on to our next question that is going to Laura Lopez from ICLE. What are the biggest challenges in or to your local governments for providing sustainable urban mobility systems?
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this invitation. As you mentioned, I work for ICLE, which is a network of cities, and I specifically work for the World Secretariat. So usually our projects are not based in Europe. We also have the European Secretariat, but I just wanted to clarify that because I am from Colombia and I work with cities in the Global South. So I just wanted to, I will talk about my experience and also about my professional and personal background. So specifically about the project I'm involved in, I work in the TUMI bus mission, which is a program that is focused on accelerating the electrification of e-bus fleets, the electrification of bus fleets in the Global South. And in terms of the challenges to accelerate this electrification, I think there are 2, and I will focus on the second one more because I think it's the one that has less attention. But the first one would be like it's still very difficult to finance the electrification of bus fleets in the Global South because the upfront costs are very high, and usually the business models are very outdated, and most of the public transportation systems are run very informally. So there is like a lot of challenges there that need to be addressed. But I think one of the second challenge that is usually, it doesn't has like a very much of a spotlight in the discussions is the service and the users. And I think we don't address this kind of things or conversation in the project. So when we talk about the users, I think that's also something that is interesting with about this panel is like who are usually the bus users. Usually the bus users are low income people, women, young people, students, entry level people in entry level jobs or low pay jobs, and also elderly. So when we talk about why people or why the bus service is not addressing or is not catering this population who are the main bus users, we have to discuss that the service is not affordable, as we discussed before, because it's too costly, because there are like the tariffs are not flat, or you have to pay every time you transfer, because usually the buses are crowded, because it doesn't respond to the type of trips young people, women are taking within the city. So usually the bus routes are very pendular and going to the city center, to the periphery, and usually some of the trips are very organic, or most of the trips that do not respond, or the bus routes are not aligned with those kind of necessities. So I think that's also that is something important that we need to address when we try to like come up with solutions or to promote this projects that are trying to promote better public transport. It's not just about electrification of the fleets. We need to discuss or we need to take into account how to improve the quality of the service that we are providing. And this and that's why it's very important also to bring young people into the conversation, as well as women and the elderly people, so we can understand what are their needs, and we can include them in this kind of project. So just like the message here is like, for example, in the project that I'm involved in, and electrification is not gonna solve everything. It's not a silver bullet. So it's very important that we take into account improving the quality of service and bring the right people to the decision-making part of the projects.
Thank you so much, Laura, for talking about the challenges for local governments for providing sustainable urban mobility. That was very interesting. Next up is Julia Dade from Bund Jugend. Our question to you is, why do the EU institutions have to consider young people when designing clean mobility policies for cities?
Well, I think the most obvious part here is that young people are the ones who will have to live in the cities in the near and further future during the climate crisis. So we need cities that are livable and sustainable, also when there will be even hotter in the summer. So although we know that, and we know that's our future and the young people who will have to live in it, the needs of young people are not taken into account. Our cities have been remodeled to fit cars and not the people living in them. And we have a situation now where the health of children and teenagers and young adults is especially harmed by air pollution, but also by insecure traffic. So one example that I like to mention is playgrounds. I'm living in Berlin, and we have a lot of those cages for playing football and basketball. So in order not to have balls rolling onto the streets, children have to play within those massive cages instead of having the city as their playground. And I think that shows really well how we gave public space up for one mode of transportation, which is individual mobility by car. Although most young people don't even have a driver's license, or don't want to have, or can't afford a car. So they are dependent then on adults who help them get from one place to another in the car, or being accompanied, because being alone in the streets is dangerous, especially small children, are often overlooked by people driving a car, especially as cars get bigger and bigger. And we all know the tragic stories of children being overlooked by drivers sitting in SUVs, for example. So I think what we have to do is to reclaim the speech, which is a slogan that we use a lot for our campaigns, which basically means that we have to take space in cities back from cars, from streets, and give it back to the people living there. We need greener streets, we need water, we need parks, we need open public spaces, so that the quality of living in cities rises, but also they get more resilience towards the climate crisis, because streets and the places we build for cars, they heaten up very, very fast in the summers. And in order to cool cities down in this time, we need more open spaces, we need more trees, we need more green areas in the cities. Another issue is that in the current system, especially women, children, young people who have health conditions in any way are usually discriminated against, because public transport often doesn't meet their needs, isn't fully accessible, and bike lanes are not even there, or in very bad conditions. It's very dangerous. We heard that a lot in the breakout rooms before. Yeah, in theory I could go by bike, but I have to risk my life. That's not the way it should be. The same is true for pedestrians. What I experience a lot is conflicts between people going by foot and people on bikes, because they're like cramped together in very small small space, while cars take up most of the space in cities. So we have those kind of two or maybe three ways of looking at the situation. We have cities that have been built for cars and not for people, and we should rethink the way we want to live and the way we want our cities to look. Then we have the second issue of a global warming, of the climate crisis, where cities have to adapt to ever hotter summers, and we have this health aspect of air pollution and of dangers in everyday life because of the way our cities prioritize cars over people. So I think that when EU institutions design clean mobility policies, they have to take all those three aspects into account and not focus on solving one of them at a time. Because, for example, by replacing the fossil fuel cars we have right now by cars with electricity, we still have those issues of space that's taken up, of streets that take the space for playgrounds, for parks, and so on and so forth. If we only think about that, we forget about that public transport, that if we only think about bike lanes, we forget the people who can't cycle a bike for various reasons. So we have to think about public transport. We have to take pedestrians into account. So I think we need an overall approach to make cities more livable, and we should take the accounts of the many interest groups within the city into account, and not only one group, which is those who have a car, who want to own a car, and who can use and want to use it every day.
Thank you, Yulia, for addressing the importance of open and public spaces and also reclaiming the streets, and to put also special focus on women and children. And now we are moving on to our business representative, James Comer from Hitachi. What is your approach in decarbonizing delivery fleets, and what are specific examples?
Sure. So I think when it comes to decarbonizing delivery fleets for customers in the UK, especially, there's a number of different barriers associated with that. Principally, one of them being a huge lack of the understanding of what it encompasses, given that traditional delivery fleets and transport fleets for companies as ICE vehicles are a case of, buy an asset, run it into the ground for the next 16 years and repair it when you crash, which it turns out is actually quite frequently, having spoken to some of our delivery customers in London. And then, past that point, just do everything you can to keep this thing alive. And so really the complexity there is taking out that need for training and societal understanding of the environment that's associated with a low carbon delivery fleet for customers. And so what we do within Hitachi is act as what we kind of call a lead integrator across all of those components. So that's everything from telematics for the vehicle to the vehicle itself, the charge point, the infrastructure, and then also a number of other really exciting things that we can do around utilizing stationary vehicles to store energy as a battery storage component, and also putting energy back into the grid as an additional revenue streams for businesses. And I think the kind of key thing with this, right, is that a lot of these companies, I'll be pretty candid with you, are, they're highly capitalist organizations that are incentivized based on a P&L. They're responsible to their stakeholders, their shareholders. And so really, we need to make this journey for them going to a decarbonized fleet as something that has a financial benefit that's associated with it. And so that's a massively heavy focus for us. And what we do there is offer things like as a service models, where all of the componentry that I just spoken about is provided to them in one succinct offering through one supplier, which is us. And then we handle all the complexity in the back end, but also build business cases for them based on the usage of available funding and things like UK's incentivized government programs for decarbonizing fleet and things like that. And a really good example of where we've done this actually is First Bus in Glasgow, the Caledonia depot it's called. So we held quite a large event there during COP26. We have a partnership now with First Bus, where it's Europe's largest bus depot. They've got about 300 different buses running out of it. And we've currently transitioned about 148 of them over to electric to date now, essentially. And that also includes a number of different components like charge point infrastructure. We've also done a lot of training for the drivers and things like this. And I think really what we've learned from that about the most important thing, that approach is everything I said around selling this back to customers and demonstrating that actually it's financially viable and worthwhile, but also looking at the long-term transition strategy for them and understanding that 2030, when you look at it in the perspective of decarbonizing a 5,000 bus fleet that First Bus has, is actually not far away at all, because by the time you get a commercial board to take decisions on decarbonizing a fleet, completely changing their entire supplier base and also retraining all of their staff, you're probably looking at 3 or 4 years of actual action in this. So, an incredibly complex thing to do, but there's certainly options, and we're certainly seeing a lot of different change in the environment and how people approach this. So a really positive message overall. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for giving us examples on how he touches decarbonizing delivery fleets, such as with the fleets in general, such as the Glasgow's largest bus depot, but then also still by outlining that for businesses, the financial aspect is still quite important. And yeah, now we're moving on to the last speaker for the first round of questions. So the next question is for our Clean Cities campaign representative, Hugo Mann. So being part of a campaign that is a European coalition of NGOs and grassroots groups aiming to encourage cities to transition to zero emission mobility by 2030, what are the main challenges you experience concerning EU policy and regulations?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me today. And a really interesting discussion, actually. I've been making lots of notes because I think there's been really interesting themes coming out of it. So thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. When I got sent the question, I thought to myself, right, I only have a couple of minutes, are really challenges. So I'm trying to think of the main ones. And I guess you can sort of divide it into two parts. I mean, just for everyone context, a big part of my job is sort of campaign orientated. So I work with like the NGOs and the local activist groups to actually sort of like, implement campaigns to encourage zero emissions mobility by 2030. And one of the big challenges before I move on to sort of the policy end of it is that, and it sounds obvious, but every country, every member state in Europe is very, very different on their sort of journey towards sort of 2030. For example, in Paris and London, there are already low emission zones, zero emission zones. There's already a culture of, this move towards our 2030 goal. So actually having conversations with groups and where they are and bringing that coalition together from the more sort of like, dare I say, sort of developed sort of cities is quite easy. But then there are other countries I've worked with or groups I've worked with where the infrastructure is not as good, or like, the kind of culture of moving towards this 2030 deadline is just not there. For example, a group I worked with in Poland, they're campaigning to actually get the first sort of low emission zone installed in Warsaw, and they're coming up against all sorts of problems in terms of creating a public narrative around that. There's lots of opposition from people talking about it doesn't make business sense to do this, all the sort of stuff which London, I recall, experienced when we were sort of implementing our first sort of low emission zone many years ago. So every country is different, and every narrative is different, and every campaign is different. So there is no one size fits all strategy. You have to adapt, and you have to work within the context of that country, of that city, of that region, which is actually quite challenging. Because you can have sort of a national sort of theory, an international sort of theory of change, but when you actually dig down into the more granular things, you realize that every campaign is going to have its own unique character. And also the groups themselves who I work with, the NGOs, are all different shapes and sizes financially in terms of the staff. So what they're capable of is different wherever I move to. So that's been one of the big challenges in bringing together a coalition, just from a practical campaigning point of view, because their needs are so varied, and what we need to provide in terms of support or finance or advice is always very, very varied, and actually part of the pleasure of the job. Every day is different. But from what I've experienced from a sort of particularly sort of EU policy regulation in terms of the campaigns I've been running, is that it's quite a simple formula that where sort of national governments regulate against ICE vehicles or sort of delivery fleets, which I'm working in, you do see sort of change. T&E, for example, had a really successful campaign on Uber and sort of ride-hailing taxi services, I think about 2 years ago. And they showed that that campaign was running in Spain and in Paris and in London. And it showed that when local city municipalities actually regulate against sort of ICE vehicles that these fleets have, those companies do move. They move, right? Because they have to, otherwise they'll lose business, and they'll basically be sort of blocked out eventually. So they have to adapt with whatever sort of the local or national government is regulating against. I mean, in terms of an EU policy area, I mean, one area which I think could be really beneficial, which in terms of helping sort of turbocharge our move towards zero emission mobility by 2030 is obviously we've got the AAQD revision coming up, the Ambient Air Quality Directive at the end of October, I believe. And obviously, if that is ambitious in what it, in terms of improving air quality in cities, that will help again further strengthen our, give us more kind of tools to actually move delivery fleets, move ICE vehicles towards electrification more quickly, because again, local city municipalities will have the power and indeed the means to sort of regulate air quality and actually sort of pick out the main offenders and actually get them to sort of move faster towards that transition, which we're all looking for. So in conclusion, it's twofold for me. It's ensuring that national and sort of EU policies are ambitious, because it's been proven that when they are, the main, we can move away from ICE vehicles, and particularly what I work in, sort of the delivery world, they do move. But also from like a practical campaigning point of view, there is no one size fits all. Every country is on a different journey. Every city is on a different journey. And therefore we have to be nimble, and we have to be flexible in terms of what we're doing. And my last point, in terms of the youth, just to add that in, I mean, it's a huge role, because actually I think the youth, in particular you guys at Generation Climate Europe, are very effective message carriers in this field, because actually from a political point of view, just my background, people listen to young people more. People like me banging the drum, I think they're tired of it. But if you have a coordinated, vocal, impactful youth presence in any campaign you run, and it's aimed and targeted correctly, I think that it's extremely effective. And I think you guys are well placed to do just that. So that is my little piece. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hugo, for the insights on campaigning and encouraging a transition to zero emissions mobility. Now we are moving on to the second round of questions before we start our dialogue with the participants in 10 minutes at 12. So I just want to thank again all the speakers for your great input and your insights on decarbonizing urban mobility for the first round of questions. Now we want to dive in a bit more into asking specific questions, and for that we will first focus on the youth aspect and urban mobility. So the first question in the second round is for Laura from UCLE. UCLE works on youth engagement. What are ways and or disadvantages to engage the youth in sustainable urban mobility?
Thank you again.
I just want to stretch that. Please keep it to 2 minutes.
Okay, no problem. Okay, I think there are no disadvantages actually, or it's just that when we bring youth to the table, I think we are also bringing everyone to the table as well. Like we are taking into account women, elderly, and in general, like underrepresented people. I think that the first thing that we need to do, and I think that's been my experience also working for the local governments and for ICLE, is the first thing that we need to do is to hear people out. And that sounds maybe like easy, but it usually is not. Also, for example, when you show up to a dialogue or to a consultation with a local government, or to in general any kind of consultation, usually men or adults are overrepresented as part of the discussion, and I think we need to make an extra effort to approach the people that usually are underrepresented in this kind of decision making and policy making spaces, I would say. So I think that's one of the things that we have to take into account, is who is underrepresented there. Always we have to ask that question to ourselves. Who, for example, is unable or is by default unwilling to speak up in a public space, or who doesn't have, for example, the means language-wise to be represent themselves in this kind of spaces. So I think that we always have to come up with ways and ideas and formats to cater those kind of necessities and to raise those voices in decision-making spaces. The second thing that I think also we have to take into account, I think, is also data, and to produce and gather data that is disaggregated, women-wise, young-wise, so we can inform the policy. And this kind of data has to be quantitative. So for example, when we are doing some transport planning, we have to take into account what kind of trips young people or women or low-income people are doing, which are usually different from regular commuting trips, and the way we plan the cities that we're focused more on men who used to work to go to the office and come back home, and that's the way that we sort of lay out our transport systems. And we have seen that that kind of way to design an urban transport system is not the correct answer for all the citizens. So that's something that we have to take into account. And also we have to bring some, let's say, qualitative data to the question. So because maybe sometimes we're focused, for example, in putting the bus stop close to a 2-minute walk or 3-minute walk from from people's homes, but we are not taking into account how difficult it is or how safe it is to take that walk to a bus stop or to a station. So we have also to take into account this kind of qualitative or perceptual opinions and visions when we are undertaking transport planning. So that's from my side.
Thank you so much, Laura, for your input. We are moving on now to Yuya for the second question. Do you have any best practice examples of how local authorities have involved youth in decarbonization or smart city planning? And also please try to keep it with 2 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I think this was at first thought to be a breakout room session. I was very looking forward to that because actually I don't have any. And I was hoping for like people in my breakout group to give me some. I've been asking around with a lot of activists that have been working with me for years. And they said, well, it often doesn't happen. Like local authorities start to plan and think kind of for children and youth as well, here and there, but they are very rarely asked for their opinion. And even if they're asked, there's like no guarantee that anything of this will be realized. For example, my younger sister had the chance to meet our with the city council and tell them what kind of changes they want to see in town. It's a very small town, and for example, we have a very dangerous train station where there have been a lot of accidents because there's like no barrier, and they asked for this barrier to be built, and it still didn't happen. I was like, well, that's such a tiny thing to ask. It's actually not even a youth-related issue; it's just a safety issue they saw. So I think a lot still has to happen here. And I don't think that only like thinking what young people might need, that's nice, and that's better than what we have seen before. But usually people live within their own like daily struggles in their everyday life, and of course when I'm not a young person, not a teenager anymore, then I do have a different everyday life, and I will not know what they need. So there's a reason why you should ask those people that are impacted by your decisions. So I kind of won't answer these questions directly because, as I said, I don't have those best practice examples from Berlin or from my personal experience, but I'm really strongly calling for kind of councils, but not only councils, because quite often that's like a prestige project and then nothing really happens, but really involving young people in city planning. We try to do that with a project called Stadtträume, which it means dreaming city space. And children were drawing the city of their dreams. We went to the Bundestag and spoke to politicians there and showed them what the city we want looks like. I was very green, very open meeting, a lot of open meeting spaces. We had trees there. We didn't have this concrete jungle with no fresh air and a lot of cars, but it was a lot about cyclists, a lot about meeting, a lot about space that reduces the conflict between different means of transportation. And was a very nice project, but still it wasn't heard in that way that it really had an impact, a direct impact, maybe a change in thinking of some people, but there's like no obligation. And I kind of missed that in a lot of initiatives.
Thank you so much, Yuya, for outlining the lack of best practices. And now we are moving on to youth engagement and campaigns for a next question for Hugo. What are the advantages of having youth engage in mobility-related campaigns, and how can they get involved? And again, please, 2 minutes.
I'm going to do my best for 2 minutes. So I guess there's a couple of points. As I say, my experience is campaigns, particularly political campaigns, and I think there's a big crossover in terms of the importance of youth. Like I said before, young people are very, very effective message carriers for traditional reasons that actually, from a PR perspective, it's always good for our decision makers to be seen to be listening to them. but also because I think that, you guys are sort of at the vanguard of, shaping your future. And I think that you have a unique voice in actually putting pressure on our elected representatives to ask them what they are doing about certain issues, in this case, sort of transitioning to clean mobility by 2030. In terms of what you guys can do, one of the things I've seen work very well, and if we had time, we could debate this, but many youth groups I've worked with in the past have often put their support behind candidates or decision makers who are, supportive of their cause and aims, and they can then go out and campaign for them and actually endorse that candidate. So if I was a youth organisation, I would scope out who out there at EU level or at national level are supportive of our aims and objectives, and then approach them directly and say, look, we're very concerned about this, we're the youth chapter of whatever. Are you going to basically support our aims or what we want to do? If they do, then actually that's a means of actually then going out and actually physically campaigning for that candidate. So I would be active, I would be visible. The youth has a massive, huge opportunity to influence, but I would also, but it has to be beyond just sort of social media. It has to be on the ground and visible, because that, I think, shows momentum. So I would say that in terms of getting involved, I would stake out who, from a decision-making point of view, is supportive of your aims and objectives, and I would get behind them to try and get them elected in whatever office it is to actually get what we want through the door from a legislative point of view. So yeah, I hope that's my 2 minutes. I know I was talking quick, so I was trying to fit a lot in as fast as I could.
Thanks so much. It was exactly 2 minutes, actually. Great. Okay, we are moving on now to, we have 2 questions left. So we are moving on now to a bit more technical aspects of urban mobility for Charlotte. How can Eastern Europe accelerate sustainable transport, such as electric vehicles, charging stations, integrated long-distance trains, and cycle paths?
No, that's a good question. I think first thing to of course, put it, starting my 10 minutes, to remember is that you have the same objectives, of course, in terms of decarbonization throughout Europe. So Central and Eastern Europe have the same recharging points objectives. They have the same multimodal hubs objectives that are put out in European legislation. So basically, they need to hurry up if they are delayed. And one way to do that is basically to apply to funding, because there is a lot of funding available for sustainable mobility, and including money for active mobility in terms of cycling infrastructure. Well, first of all, because they are lagging behind, so there is often in a funding tool such as the Connecting Europe facility mechanism, or also the Recovery and Resilience funds, but also the more classical regional funds. They all take into consideration whether one country has already received a lot of funding for that or whether others have not. So if they're lagging behind, well, then there is really a lot of funding available. Plus, there's also new rules that has made it easier in terms of technical procedures to apply for Central and Eastern European countries. So that's one. And second is also the SUMP, the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans, which is a key tool. So by putting in place these SUMPs with key KPIs and indicators to measure whether they are actually effective, is also something that Central and Eastern European cities can really work with, I would say. So I think those are funding and the SUMPs, really main tools.
Thank you so much for Charlotte for outlining that there is funding available and to outline again the SUMPs. Now moving on to the last question, before we move on to the questions from participants, which is for James from Hitachi. Because of Hitachi's major plans with fleet owners to switch to electric vehicles, what plans does Hitachi have to deal with the increase of demand for resources needed for the lithium-ion batteries?
Sure. Yeah, it's a tough question, actually, to be honest with you. I'm also partly responsible for our corporate strategy within Hitachi. So it's definitely something that occupies a lot of my my time and my headspace. I think the honest answer here is that we need to move beyond the current models that we have, right? Hitachi is a $70 billion company a year, right? And we have this massive ethos within our zero carbon business that although we're part of that massive behemoth of a corporate giant, we need to utilize capitalist economics to do good for the world. And so that's why we're focusing in this EV area. And so although we've got the buying power to secure these assets, you're right in that over time, it's going to become increasingly difficult for us to secure them even with that amount of buying power. And so we've started opening up some different channels, principally conversations around circular economy. And one of those things, if I give you a specific example, is that the standard of health of a battery is directly correlated to the usage that you can have for it. So if I take a vertical takeoff manufacturer, someone making planes, then they need a battery standard of health to be above about 92% efficiency, whereas we only need it at 70%. So there's a real gap there over that percentage difference where we can take it from that other supplier, buy it off of them at the residual value of the battery at the end of their term, and then utilize it until we hit the 70% mark, and then we can pass it to somebody else, or we can put it in the ground and use it for energy storage. So there's a lot of opportunity, but it really means thinking about this in a slightly different way. And so in tune with that as well, we've also looked at things around special purpose vehicles, which is a financial instrument for holding assets. And we look to have external investment for that too, because we can then start to build out this picture of what happens with an asset as we move it across a 16-year life cycle, moving it between different parties, doing residual value calculations to cover off that financial aspect that I talked about earlier, and ensuring that there's a financial business case behind this, but also then, like you say, we can start to move away from a reliance on mining these new precious metals all the time to try and fill this gap in supply and demand that realistically the world's just not going to be able to do over the next couple of decades.
Thank you so much, James, for giving your input from a business perspective, and also to talk a bit about circular economy as a solution to this. And now, to keep a bit an eye on the agenda, let's go to open the floor to questions for the participants. We want to stretch it. This is not just a Q&A, but rather a dialogue. So please feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom settings, and then we tell you you can ask the questions. And that also goes to the speakers. You can also ask the questions. So please raise your hands now, and yeah, feel free to engage in a discussion. Any first questions? Sarah, yeah, you can go ahead.
Hi. So just a bit of background. I come from Malta, where basically politics there are inherently partisan. So if youths were to offer support to a candidate who has an agenda in line with their beliefs, particularly, in this case, sustainable mobility, it can prove to be quite problematic. So in that case, how would you recommend that youths proceed if they want action to be taken?
Yeah, sure, it's a good point. And I think that perhaps I was thinking specifically of my experience here in the UK. I mean, I guess you don't have to maybe endorse a candidate. You can actually just sort of be far more sort of just vocal in your group yourself, and actually sort of either call out or support candidates without actually having to sort of get them on board to say that you're teaming up. From my experience though, and again, I know it's very, very different in different countries, and it's very much dependent on where you are. But for example, when I worked for the People's Vote campaign over here, which was a campaign that was trying to stop Brexit, we had a youth wing, and one thing which was very successful was we just asked candidates to sign a pledge. So it wasn't saying like we're endorsing you as a political party. It was simply like, do you agree in this case that the Brexit deal should go back to the people? So it wasn't so much saying we're endorsing the Labour Party, not the Conservatives, but or the Liberal Democrats or the Greens. It was more just saying, do you support our aims, and putting the emphasis back on the candidate or the politicians themselves. So I guess it's how you frame it, and it's almost like what your narrative is. But I totally take your point that actually, depending on where you are and what country you're in, that can at times be problematic.
Thank you.
Any next questions? Yes, Gemma or Morgane? I don't know who was first.
Go ahead, Gemma.
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question for James, which is, oh God, I've got too many. So we've kind of established that, like, if every car became an electric vehicle, it would be a good step, but it wouldn't solve all the problems of the cities, such as congestion, double parking, traffic, and like health and safety. So do you have any plans at Hitachi for dealing with like a lessening of cars, for example, having like a drop box in the city center, rather than like door-to-door deliveries? And do you have any plans to like work with your customers and that kind of thing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The majority of the congestion in cities, especially in London, where I'm currently sat, as it's just started chucking it down with rain, which is lovely, is definitely one of the largest problems. I think the reality is it's really difficult to make holistic, large-scale change across consumer habits. We have a lot of discussions with OZEV, which is the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles, and the Department for Transport in the UK, around how we influence personal driver behaviours to avoid these things. And we also run a program called Optimise Prime, which is the world's largest electric vehicle trial. We've got 6,000 EVs linked up to our systems that collect data against their charging and their usage. And we have a really standing out the back of that, of how drivers behave. And I think we need large holistic policy change in this area to make a difference. You're right, we need to stop people driving into the city by mandating that it becomes incredibly difficult. London's doing quite a good job of that more recently with the congestion zone, which is now being extended to electric vehicles. So for those of you who don't know, you currently have to pay about £15 to drive into central London, and that's going to then be extended to every vehicle that drives into central London. So really, we need backing in things like that, but also we need to make other options more accessible. And so Hitachi's focus in that area is principally around looking at public transport infrastructure, creating end-to-end journeys. And that exercise earlier with Google Maps was a great representation of that, right? Because we talked about the ease of use for different vehicles, and things like if you're in a part of London where you need to get a bus and a train, that's two separate tickets where you need to tap in. The cost is really difficult. But also, in terms of planning that, it's incredibly hard as a consumer. So until that's ready, it's going to be really difficult to convince people not to drive a car. And that's why we're doing things like a program in Genoa, Italy, where there's one ticket on your phone that covers every single journey you do in that space. So if you get on a tube or a tram or a bus, or you rent a mobility bike, an electric bike in the city, that is all covered under that one ticket, which really means that, it's kind of linked up to that conversation earlier where I was saying about, for business, you just need to remove the pain. You need to start every decision that you're making here from what's going through that consumer's head, what's going through that business's head when they're making these decisions. It's not going, oh, well, I want to be better for the environment. If we're being totally honest with each other, that's just not most people's mindset at the moment. Most people just want to have the easiest, best journey possible. And so if you can find a way to do that really effectively at policy level, then you will enact that large scale change that you're looking to achieve. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, James. Charlotte, you're next.
Yes, I actually wanted to contribute to that, and I think something you touched upon, which really also makes resonates, is this one ticket thing. which can be tackled from different perspectives, but the importance is that you find that instead of a car, as you said, that you have other options available. And so one of the challenges today is that, of course, we have Google Maps, but not even Google Maps shows all options available often, and doesn't really show all the different public transport options. And by the way, it doesn't always show the easiest routes. So you often have to know the city yourself in order to know which way is the smartest, and where you might be able to just, and this is a very important part, it's the active mobility part, the walking or cycling often, which is not included, that if you walk just 50 meters from one stop to another, then that can connect you really easily. And so at European level, what we're looking into, what we can do, it's of course only one part of the puzzle, but something which in another horrible jargon is called the multimodal digital mobility services. So the idea is to alleviate access to data, basically, so that any type of new mobility service or public transport service or any can access the data of other types of services, so that you can have these multimodal apps, basically. So like City Hopper, but there's not that many of them actually today. So multimodal apps like Google Maps, but also where you can reserve your tickets ideally. And one of the reasons why you don't have these multimodal transport mobility apps is that some of the transport operators, whether it's trains or public transport, they maybe are sitting very heavily on their own data, and they which is also understandable. It's not always easy to just say, oh, well, take my data. So voila, this is something we're working on to make it easier to share this data, and so that these multimodal transport or mobility apps can see the day, and that we can have much more of them, and so that the users are able to see better which options are available to them.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and for the other speakers. We are now having the Commissioner for Environment just joined us now for giving some closing remarks. So thank you so much for joining us, Commissioner Virginia Sinkevicius. And it's an honor to have you here with us today. So if you want, you can go ahead now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And of course, good afternoon to everyone. And of course, thank you for this invitation. I see you have had wide-ranging discussions. I hope they, of course, were interesting and enriching. Your voices are important for so many reasons. It's your future, and it's important that you are getting involved in shaping and giving politics the direction and steering that it needs. Young people have more knowledge and more technology at their fingertips than any other generation before. And you are the people who will be most affected by climate change, by biodiversity loss, pollution, but you are also the people who will carry the torch of environmentalism to 2050. So you need to keep feeding that flame, because it's absolutely crucial that Europe will become climate neutral by the middle of the century. And you didn't make this crisis, but we need your energy, your help to solve it. And I do believe you can do it. You have the resourcefulness and you have the commitment. Decarbonization, of course, means covering all the angles, acting on every front. Mobility is one of those prime examples of this. There are actions for individuals, actions for cities, regions, and of course, actions to be taken at the European level. And it's not about reducing mobility, first of all. I think what's very important, it's about reducing mobility that's dirty, costly, and short-sighted. And it's about replacing that with transport modes that are cleaner and smarter. So what we reduce are the impacts on the climate, on the air, and the water. So reducing nuisance, reducing noise, and improving our daily lives. And as I said, there are actions for everyone involved. Many cities are working to adapt smarter transport and better logistics. They are looking to integrate new mobility services and devices into the overall urban mobility systems, and finding ways to facilitate cycling and walking, micro-mobility. The Commission is trying to help with an EU transport framework for cities and regions, helping them develop safe, accessible, inclusive mobility long before, of course, 2050. And of course, we are pushing hard for new zero-emission cars and vans. The CO2 standards we proposed in the Fit for 55 package are a huge step in that direction. One of the key elements is there that it is the 100% target for zero emissions new vehicles in 2035. Both the European Parliament and Council agree with the Commission view here, and they are backing that target for 2035. And as we work to finalize that proposal and bring it into European law, but ultimately, of course, it's about young people like you, your choices, your decisions about what matters, and your determination to push for change. And there is always a long way to go. It's not an easy task, but I believe that if you will keep pushing, keep on asking for more, we will be coming closer, because that's the only way to deliver a real change, the real change what our planet really needs.
Thank you so much for joining us and for your closing remarks. And it's an honor to have you here with us today. So thank you very much for your input, and we really appreciate that you have joined us.
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting.
You're welcome. Okay, we're moving on now to have a little bit of an introduction to our policy paper, which will just take some minutes. And I just want to again thank everyone for your input, all the speakers, and also for the participants to ask questions. I will now just discuss a bit the policy paper. So, because in part of the project where the policy paper we wrote and this online dialogue that we are doing now is taking place, we had just published this week a policy paper about the decarbonizing urban mobility, and where we analyze the current EU initiatives. And we also put it in the chat now, and you can also find it on our website. So just to give a quick summary, in this policy paper, we analyzed the EU's recent initiatives and proposals on transport and urban mobility and the expected effects and improvement potentials on the decarbonization of urban mobility. And the paper outlines also the importance of cities in decarbonizing urban mobilities, and also in general the challenges of implementing low and zero emissions transport options in European cities. And we also focused on delivery fleets as an example of a specific sector that is in need of reducing emissions. And here we came to the following conclusions. First of all, there's a bit of a car-centric policymaking focus on the EU policies, like they see electric vehicles as a bit of the remedy to the transport problem. Second of all, there's a lack of intergenerational justice in EU policymaking. So there's a bit of a lack on including the youth in EU policies and the policymaking process itself. And there's no EU regulation on public transport, cycling and walking, and more initiatives are needed and more public funding in these alternative modes of transport. And also there's an EU regulation needed that tackles the rising emissions growth of delivery fleets. And so just to give a bit of a background of the recommendations we developed at GCE, First of all, we need regulations and more funding and better infrastructures for public transport, cycling and walking in European cities. Second, we need to develop a sustainable urban mobility plan for all cities, not just major cities, which is a most focus in the EU policies. And we also need stronger emissions targets for cars and a regulation on zero emission vehicle quotas for delivery fleets. And the EU also needs to create space for young people as leaders in EU decision making. So in conclusion, to conclude our paper, this car-centric policymaking focus of the EU is no longer the remedy to the transport problem. We need a more human-centric focus to ensure that European cities become cleaner, healthy, and more livable. And now I want to pass on back to Hermione.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kelly. So before we close, let's have a look at the live sketching that Fanny has been doing throughout the event. So Fanny, if you want to share your screen and say a few words.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Yes, I will show you a bit about the, first the time lapse of the drawing, so you can see a bit of my creative process also. Well, it has been very, very interesting. Very grateful I was here today with you guys. And yeah, we were thinking today, actually, we need a systemic view on urban mobility topics. So why not using also a visualization tool to kind of connect ideas together and make it more clear, and also highlighting maybe what we don't really see. So for example, we can make a kind of a parallel, as also a systemic view is needed in the topic we are talking about today. We need more accessible. We need to have a more accessible urban mobility system, including women, elderly people in the decision making, for example. Also, we need to see it in a systemic way, because there are different contexts and because there are different narrative. Every narrative is different, as Hugo said, if I remember well. So yeah, youth is here. Youth voice has to be present and being listened, and also has a huge opportunity to influence on the ground. Thank you so much for your presence today, and we will be sharing the drawing to all of you after the event.
Thank you, Fanny. The outcome really looks incredible, so thank you very much. And once again, thank you to everyone who was here. So once again, we want to stretch that you can read our policy paper, and in general, you can find more information about our project by visiting our website. So now a final thank you to all the participants and to our speakers. Thank you for the fruitful discussion. And yes, you can stay in touch with us via our social media.